April 14, 1945. Outskirts of Weimar, Thuringia. The air smelled of damp earth and burning wood. Spring rains had softened the roads into rivers of mud, and the convoy of American trucks churned through them with mechanical indifference. Olive-drab vehicles stretched along the narrow village road like a slow-moving serpent of liberation. Inside the half-timber-bird houses that lined the cobblestone streets, women watched from behind lace curtains, silent, terrified. Waiting. Anna Schrader pressed her forehead against the cold glass of her kitchen window. Her hands trembled. She was 32 years old, a schoolteacher's widow, mother of 2 girls who now hid upstairs beneath a feather bed. The roar of engines grew louder. Dust and exhaust fumes clouded the street. She had heard the stories whispered in breadlines, murmured in church basement, stories of what armies did when they entered defeated towns, stories of retribution, stories of justice served hot and merciless. But what Anna Schrader could not have known, what none of the women peering through those windows could have anticipated, was that the men in those trucks carried something far more unsettling than weapons and anger. They carried mercy. And in a nation conditioned by 12 years of ideological warfare, mercy was the most foreign concept of all. To understand the weight of that April morning, one must first understand what Germany had become by the spring of 1945. This was not merely a defeated nation. This was a society that had been systematically conditioned to believe that weakness was a sin, that compassion was decadence, that the world was divided into victors and victims with no middle ground. From the moment Adolf Hitler seized power in 1933, every institutions, schools, churches, youth organizations, the press had been weaponized to deliver a singular message: strength is virtue, domination is destiny, and sentimentality is the poison of democracy. By 1945, Germany had been at war for nearly 6 years. The citizens, who remained mostly women, children, and the elderly, had endured relentless Allied bombing campaigns that reduced cities to skeletal ruins. Hamburg had burned in firestorms. Dresden had been vaporized in a single night of incendiary terror. Berlin was a graveyard of shattered monuments and makeshift graves. Food was scarce. Fuel was scarce. Hope was scarce, but fear was abundant. German civilians had been told what would happen when the enemy arrived. Goebbels' propaganda ministry had spent years painting the Allies, particularly the Soviets, but also the Americans, as barbaric hordes bent on revenge. Newsreels showed Soviet atrocities. Radio broadcasts warned of mass executions, systematic rape, wholesale destruction. The message was clear: surrender meant annihilation. Resistance was futile, but capitulation was suicide. And so, when the Americans rolled into towns like Weimar, the civilian population expected the worst. They expected punishment. They expected humiliation. They expected to pay for 12 years of complicity, for the banners they had hung, for the salutes they had given, for the silence they had kept. What they did not expect was to be treated like human beings. The trucks stopped in the town square. Engines died one by one, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the sound of boots hitting pavement. American soldiers dismounted young men, most of them barely out of adolescence, their uniforms mud-stained and worn. They carried M1 Garand rifles slung over their shoulders, but their hands hung loose at their sides. No weapons drawn. No orders barked. They looked tired. Anna watched from her window as an officer, a lieutenant, she guessed, though she knew nothing of American insignia, began speaking to a small group of civilians who had been ordered into the square by loudspeaker. His voice was calm, unhurried. An interpreter stood beside him, translating his words into stiff, formal German. "We are not here to harm you," the lieutenant said. "We are here to establish order and ensure your safety. Anyone who cooperates will be treated fairly. We need information about remaining military units, about supplies, about infrastructure. If you help us, we will help you." The civilians stood motionless, disbelieving. One elderly man, Herr Zimmermann, the baker, finally spoke up, his voice shaking. "What about the party members? What about those who were loyal?" The lieutenant looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something that would be repeated in whispered conversations for weeks to come. That's for courts to decide. Not for us. Not today. This was not an isolated incident. Across Germany, in the spring of 1945, as American forces swept through towns and villages, a pattern emerged that baffled the civilian population. Unlike the Red Army advancing from the east, whose brutality was well documented and whose thirst for vengeance was understandable, given the horrors inflicted upon the Soviet Union, the Americans operated under strict codes of conduct, enforced by military police and commanding officers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had issued clear directives. American soldiers were to act as representatives of democratic civilization. Looting was prohibited. Fraternization with German civilians was initially forbidden. Violence against non-combatants was to be punished. The goal was not merely to defeat Germany militarily, but to demonstrate the moral superiority of democratic governance. This was psychological warfare of a different kind. The Americans understood something profound about human nature and ideology. People who expect punishment but receive fairness experienced cognitive dissonance that can shatter deeply held beliefs. If the enemy you have been taught to hate treats you with unexpected decency, it forces you to question everything you were told about that enemy and, by extension, everything you were told by those who taught you to hate. Of course, the reality was more complex. There were incident soldiers who stole, who drank too much, who took advantage of desperation. There were commanders who looked the other way. War is never clean, and no army is composed entirely of saints. But the overarching policy, the institutional approach, was markedly different from what German propaganda had predicted, and that difference was devastating to Nazi ideology. Anna Schrader did not venture outside that first day. She kept her daughters upstairs and rationed the last of their potatoes into a thin soup. But by the third day, necessity forced her into the street. The American command had established a food distribution point in the town hall, and though pride screamed at her to stay hidden, hunger screamed louder. She joined the line of women and elderly men waiting in the square. The queue moved slowly. At the front, American soldiers distributed canned goods from wooden crates, rations marked with English words she could not read. When her turn came, a young soldier, no more than 20, with red hair and freckles that reminded her of her late husband's cousin, placed 4 cans into her outstretched bag without looking at her face. Ma'am, he said, nodding. She stared at him. Ma'am, not Frau, not you. Ma'am, a word of respect, given casually, as if she were a person and not a defeated enemy. The soldier noticed her staring. He smiled a quick, embarrassed smile and gestured to the cans. It's good stuff, he said, in broken German. Beef? Beans? For your kids? Yeah. Anna's throat tightened. She nodded once, took the bag, and hurried away before the tears could fall. That night, she opened one of the cans with a dull knife. The beef was tender, rich, suspended in thick gravy that smelled like nothing her family had eaten in 2 years. Her daughters devoured it in silence, licking the insides of the can clean. As Anna watched the meat, she thought about the soldier's face, how young he was, how ordinary, and she felt something crack inside her chest. For 12 years, she had been told that Americans were decadent, weak, corrupted by Jewish influence and capitalist greed. She had believed it, or at least, she had not questioned it. Belief and silence were often indistinguishable in those years. But no decadent, weak society sent soldiers who spoke politely to the wives of their enemies, who gave food to children whose fathers had fought to kill them. The can sat on her kitchen table for days afterward. She could not bring herself to throw it away. The recurring presence of American rations, those ubiquitous olive green cans stamped with military codes, became a silent symbol of ideological collapse throughout occupied Germany. The cans appeared everywhere, in kitchens, in schoolrooms converted to refugee shelters, in churches where priests distributed aid. They were tangible proof of American industrial capacity, of a nation so abundant that it could feed not only its own soldiers, but also the civilians of its defeated enemy. This was not accidental. American policymakers understood the propaganda value of food. Herbert Hoover, who had coordinated European relief efforts after World War I, advised the Truman administration that hunger was the breeding ground for extremism. A starving population would embrace any ideology that promised bread. But a fed population, particularly one fed by its former enemy, would begin to question the narratives that had led to starvation in the first place. The contrast was stark and deliberate. While Soviet-occupied zones in eastern Germany faced systematic confiscation of resources, factories dismantled, crops requisitioned, entire communities displaced, the American zone saw the rapid establishment of supply chains designed to prevent starvation and disease. Within weeks of occupation, American engineers had repaired water systems, restored electrical grids, and organized medical clinics. The goal was stabilization, not retribution. German civilians noticed. They could not help but notice. By late April, the initial terror had begun to fade, replaced by wary confusion. The Americans had been in Weimar for 2 weeks. No mass arrests. No executions. No systematic rape campaigns. Life remained, hard rationing was strict, curfews were enforced, and the presence of military police was constant, but the anticipated bloodbath had not materialized. Anna Schrader began venturing out more frequently. She needed to register with the American authorities to receive a ration card, to report the status of her home, to inquire about news of her brother who had been conscripted into the Volksturm in the war's final chaotic months. The bureaucracy was mad. Forms, stamps, more lines, but it was bureaucracy, not brutality. One afternoon, while waiting outside the makeshift command post, she overheard a conversation between 2 American soldiers. They were sitting on the steps, smoking cigarettes. Their rifles leaned against the wall. One of them was complaining about the food. "I swear to God, if I eat one more can of that hash, I'm gonna lose it," he muttered. "My mum's meatloaf. That's all I want. Just one plate of my mum's meatloaf." The other soldier laughed. "Yeah, well, you'll get it when we get home. Couple more months, maybe. Couple more months of this shit." Anna did not understand all the English words, but she understood the tone, the casual boredom, the homesickness, the mundane complaint about food. These were not conquerors drunk on power. These were boys who missed their mothers. It was such a small moment. Insignificant, really? But it lodged in her memory like a splinter. The question that haunted many German civilians during those weeks was simple and terrible. Why? Why did the Americans not exact revenge? Why did they establish courts instead of execution walls? Why did they bother feeding people who had cheered for their destruction? The answer was rooted in something the Nazi regime had spent 12 years trying to eradicate: the belief in universal human rights, in the inherent dignity of the individual, in justice as something more than the will of the strong, imposed upon the weak American. Soldiers carried with them often, unconsciously, the cultural inheritance of Enlightenment. Philosophy filtered through 2 centuries of democratic experiment. They had been raised in a society that, despite its profound flaws and hypocrisies, fundamentally believed that rights were not privileges granted by the state but intrinsic qualities that no government could legitimately revoke. This belief was so woven into the American psyche that even young men with no formal education in political theory acted upon it instinctively. When a 19-year-old private from Iowa told a German woman, "We're not here to hurt you," he was not making a tactical calculation. He was stating what seemed obvious to him: hurting civilians was wrong, regardless of what their government had done. This was not naivety. American soldiers were fully aware of Nazi atrocities. Many had participated in the liberation of concentration camps, and had seen horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Their refusal to engage in collective punishment was not born of ignorance, but of principle. For German civilians conditioned to believe that might made right, this was incomprehensible. The ideological dissonance reached its peak when American authorities began implementing denazification programs. In early May, all residents of Weimar were required to attend a screening of footage from the recently liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. Located just 5 miles outside the town, Anna Schrader sat in the darkened theater with hundreds of others. She had heard rumors about Buchenwald, Everyone had, but rumors were easily dismissed, easily rationalized. The film was not. The images were silent testimony. Mountains of skeletal corpses, survivors with hollow eyes and protruding bones, ovens designed for industrial-scale murder, lampshades made from human skin. The projector clicked, and word, someone in the audience vomited. Many wept. Anna sat frozen, her hands gripping the armrests. When the lights came up, an American officer stood before them. He did not shout. His voice was steady, factual, devastating. "This," he said through the interpreter, "is what was done in your name. 5 miles from your homes. You will not be punished collectively for these crimes. That would make us no better than those who committed them. But you will know. You will remember. And you will carry this knowledge for the rest of your lives." Then he dismissed them. The walk home was silent. Anna moved through the streets in a daze, surrounded by others who could not meet each other's eyes. She thought about the parties she had attended, where SS officers smiled and drank wine. She thought about the Jewish family that had lived 3 houses down until 1938, and how she had not asked where they went. She thought about the lies she had told herself, that she did not know, that she could not have known, that it was not her responsibility. The Americans had given her a choice. She did not want to confront the truth, or to harden into denial. Many chose denial. It was easier, safer, more psychologically bearable. But for some, for Anna, for women like her across occupied Germany, the confrontation was inescapable. And the fact that this confrontation came not with a bullet, but with evidence, not with revenge, but with the demand for moral reckoning, made it all the more shattering. By June, a strange new normal had emerged in the American presence had become routine. Children learned to beg for chocolate from passing jeeps. Women queued for rations with the wariness of habit. The initial fear had been replaced by something more complex, a mixture of gratitude, resentment, shame, and cautious hope. Anna found work as a translator for the American Civil Affairs Office. Her English was limited but functional. Learned years ago in secondary school, before such foreign languages were discouraged. The work was tedious, translating property records, identification papers, endless bureaucratic documents, but it provided extra rations and kept her mind occupied. One afternoon, a young German man, barely 18, still wearing the tattered remnants of a Wehrmacht uniform, was brought before the American lieutenant she worked with. The boy had been found hiding in a barn, half-starved, terrified. He had deserted in the war's final days and was convinced he would be executed as a traitor by either side. The lieutenant questioned him briefly through Anna. Where was his unit? Were there other deserters? Any remaining weapons, caches? The boy answered in monosyllables, his voice shaking. When the questions ended, he looked up at the lieutenant with the eyes of someone awaiting a death sentence. The lieutenant sighed. He scribbled something on a form and handed it to Anna. "Tell him to report to the displaced persons camp on the east side of town. They'll give him food and a place to sleep. When things stabilize, he can go home." Anna translated. The boy stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "That's it," he whispered. "He's not going to—" "That's it," Anna said quietly. The boy began to cry deep, shuddering sobs of relief and exhaustion. The lieutenant looked uncomfortable. He waved toward the door. "Get him out of here," he muttered to the MP at the door. Then, to Anna, "Next case." She watched the boy stumble out, still weeping, and thought about how simple mercy could break a person more thoroughly than cruelty ever could. This pattern repeated itself. Across occupied Germany in countless variations, Nazi Party members who had not committed specific war crimes were processed, documented, and often released with restrictions on employment and political participation. The focus was on identifying and prosecuting major perpetrators, the architects of genocide, the camp command, the SS officers who had carried out atrocities, not on punishing every citizen who had displayed a swastika banner or joined the party to keep their job. This was not leniency born of indifference. It was strategic moral clarity. The Americans understood that rebuilding a stable, democratic Germany required distinguishing between active participation in evil and passive complicity between those who had killed and those who had merely looked away. The former required justice. The latter required education and the slow, painful work of cultural transformation. Of course, this approach was imperfect. Many genuine war criminals slipped through the cracks, protected by false papers or the chaos of displacement. Denazification programs were often inconsistent, undermined by Cold War pragmatism, as former Nazis with useful skills were quietly rehabilitated to serve as bulwarks against Soviet influence. Justice was incomplete. It always is. But the fundamental principle that collective punishment was morally wrong. That individuals should be judged by their actions, rather than their nationality or association represented. A radical break from the cycle of revenge that had poisoned Europe for centuries. German civilians noticed this too. They could not help but notice. By autumn, the American occupation had settled into a routine that felt almost mundane. Heidelberg, largely undamaged by bombing, became the headquarters of the American military government. Frankfurt began rebuilding. In smaller towns, military governance gradually transitioned to German civilian administration under American oversight. Anna Schrader continued her work as a translator. Her daughters returned to school, now purged of Nazi curriculum, taught instead by carefully vetted teachers, using hastily printed textbooks that emphasized science, literature, and mathematics rather than racial theory and militarism. The transformation was jarring. Subjects that had been mandatory just months ago were now forbidden. Books that had lined library shelves were now banned. One evening, Anna's oldest daughter, Greta, 13 years old, came home from school with a question. "Mama," she said hesitantly, "were we wrong?" "About everything." Anna looked at her daughter's face, still so young, but old enough to understand that the world she had been taught to believe in had been a lie. How did you answer such a question? How did you explain complicity to a child? "Yes," Anna said finally. "We were wrong, but you said, 'I know what I said.' I was wrong too." Greta was silent for a long moment. Then, the teacher said the Americans have something called a constitution, that it protects people from the government. "Is that true?" "I think so." "Did we ever have anything like that?" Anna thought about the Weimar Republic, about the democratic institutions that had been dismantled piece by piece in the early 1930s, while people like her stood by and watched. "We did," she said. "Once, and we let it die." Greta absorbed this. Could it happen again? Could we be like them? Like the Americans? It was the question an entire nation was beginning to ask. To understand why this question mattered, one must understand the nature of ideological collapse. The Nazi regime had not merely been a government, it had been a totalizing worldview that explained everything: history, race, destiny, morality. It had provided answers to fundamental questions about meaning and purpose. When that worldview shattered, it left a vacuum. Into that vacuum, the Americans brought something unexpected. Not a new totalizing ideology, but an invitation to pluralism. Democracy, as practiced by the United States, was messy, contentious, inefficient. It allowed disagreement. It protected dissent. It assumed that no one person or party had a monopoly on truth. For a population conditioned to believe that strength came from unity and obedience, this was both liberating and terrifying. Some Germans embraced it eagerly, seeing in American democracy a path to redemption and renewal. Others rejected it bitterly, clinging to nationalist resentment and the myth of betrayal, the same psychological defense mechanism that had poisoned Germany after World War I, but many perhaps most existed in an uncertain middle ground, trying to reconcile what they had been with what they might become. The cans of American rations sat on their shelves as daily reminders of this tension. Each time a German civilian opened one of those cans, they confronted a simple, undeniable fact: the enemy they had been taught to despise was keeping them alive. Years later, when historians attempted to explain how Germany transformed from a totalitarian into a stable democracy, an outcome that had seemed impossible in 1945, they pointed to many factors. The Marshall Plan's economic investment, the division of Germany, and the threat of Soviet expansion, the Nuremberg trials and their emphasis on individual accountability, the patient work of re-education programs, but beneath all these structural factors was something more fundamental: the experience of mercy when vengeance was expected, the experience of justice that distinguished between perpetrators and bystanders, the experience of being treated as human beings capable of moral choice rather than as a homogeneous enemy mass deserving only destruction. This experience did not erase guilt. It did not undo atrocity. It did not resurrect the millions who had been murdered in the name of racial purity and national destiny. But it broke the cycle of humiliation and revenge that had dominated European geopolitics for generations. It demonstrated that victors could be magnanimous without being weak, that justice could be pursued without descending into barbarism, that even former enemies could be brought into a community of shared values. This was revolutionary, and it was deeply, profoundly American, not because Americans were morally superior, but because American political culture, for all its contradictions and failures, had been built on principles that transcended the immediate passions of war. Anna Schrader never forgot the young American soldier who had handed her those first cans of rations and called her ma'am. She never forgot the lieutenant who had let the deserter go free. She never forgot the officer who had forced her to watch the Buchenwald footage and then told her she would not be punished. Collectively, in 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was formally established with a constitution that guaranteed human rights and democratic governance, Anna stood in the town square and listened to the proclamation being read aloud. She was 36 years old. Her daughters stood beside her. Around them, the town was still scarred by war buildings, still bore shrapnel marks. Empty lots marked where homes had been destroyed, but reconstruction was underway. The Americans were still present, but their role had shifted. No longer occupiers, they were now allies. The Cold War had begun, and West Germany had become a strategic partner in the confrontation with Soviet communism. The irony was not lost on anyone. Yesterday's mortal enemies had become today's essential friends, as Anna listened to the words of the new Constitution articles, guaranteeing freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, protection from arbitrary arrest. She thought about how impossible this moment had seemed just 4 years earlier. She thought about the fear she had felt watching those American trucks roll into town. She thought about the mercy she had witnessed when she had expected only punishment. And she understood, perhaps for the first time, what freedom actually meant. Not simply the absence of tyranny, but the presence of institutions that protected human dignity, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was difficult, even when the people being protected were former enemies who did not necessarily deserve such protection. This was the gift the Americans had given, not because Germany had earned it, but because the alternative was to perpetuate the very brutality they had fought to defeat. That first can of American beef rations remained on Anna's kitchen shelf for years. She kept it long after the label faded, long after the usefulness of the object had passed. It became a relic, a reminder, a small monument to the moment when her understanding of the world had fundamentally shifted. Other families kept similar tokens: a chocolate bar wrapper given by a GI to a starving child, a blanket stamped with U.S. Army markings, a photograph of American soldiers helping rebuild a damaged church. These objects became part of the material culture of transformations. Small, mundane items imbued with enormous symbolic weight. They represented not just survival, but the possibility of redemption. They were proof that the world did not have to operate according to the brutal logic of domination and revenge. They suggested that there might be another way: messy, imperfect, frustratingly inefficient, but ultimately more humane. This was not propaganda, it was lived experience. And lived experience has a power that no amount of rhetoric can match. When Anna Schrader died in 1982, her daughters cleaned out her small apartment and found the cans still sitting on a shelf in the kitchen. By then, West Germany had become an economic powerhouse, a model democracy, a full member of NATO and the European community. The American presence had long since normalized U.S. military bases dotted the landscape. American culture permeated German youth movements. The transatlantic alliance was a cornerstone of Western geopolitics. But for Greta, holding that faded can in her hands, all the abstract history collapsed into a single, tangible moment. Her mother standing in a food line in April 1945, receiving rations from an enemy soldier who had called her ma'am. She kept the can. It sits now in a museum in Berlin, in an exhibition about the occupation period. A small placard explains its significance. Visitors walk past it quickly, eager to see more dramatic artifacts, weapons, uniforms, documents. Few pause to contemplate the quiet radicalism of that empty metal container. But for those who understand what it represents, the ideological earthquake that occurred when mercy replaced vengeance, when justice superseded revenge, when former enemies were treated as human beings capable of change, that can is perhaps the most profound artifact of the entire post-war period. The truth about freedom, about democracy, about the principles that would eventually rebuild Western Europe from the ashes of total war, was this: they were most convincing not when they were proclaimed from podiums or written in treaties, but when they were embodied in small, daily acts of unexpected decency. When a soldier gave food to a child whose father had tried to kill him, when an officer released a deserter instead of executing him, when a military government chose due process over expedience, bureaucracy over brutality, education over extermination. These acts did not erase the guilt of 12 years of Nazi rule. They did not resurrect the dead or undo the Holocaust. They did not make the perpetrators innocent or the bystanders blameless, but they demonstrated something that the Nazi ideology had fundamentally denied: that human beings, given the opportunity and the institutional framework, were capable of choosing mercy over cruelty, justice over revenge, hope over despair, and in that demonstration lay the seeds of transformation. 70 years later, when historians debate why German democracy succeeded after 1945, when it had failed after 1918, when they analyze the factors that prevented the kind of resentment and revanchism that had led to the Second World War, they often focus on economic programs and political structures, but perhaps the answer is simpler and more profound. Perhaps it lies in the thousands of Anschreiters who watched American soldiers enter their towns and expected punishment, but received something they had been taught to believe was weakness, fairness, process, and the radical proposition that even defeated enemies possessed inalienable human dignity. Perhaps it lies in the cognitive dissonance created when the decadent, weak democracy proved stronger, more generous, and more just than the 1,000-year Reich that had collapsed in 12 years of horror. Perhaps it lies in the empty cans that sat on kitchen shelves. Across occupied Germany, silent testimonies to the revolutionary idea that abundance should be shared, that power should be restrained, and that the purpose of victory was not domination, but the creation of a world where such wars would never be necessary again. This was not naivety. It was not weakness. It was not sentimentality. It was the most radical and effective form of warfare ever devised, the war for hearts and minds, fought not with propaganda, but with principle, not with coercion, but with example. And it was won not on battlefields, but in moments like these moments, when a young soldier handed a can of rations to a frightened woman and called her ma'am, when an officer chose mercy over vengeance, when an entire military force demonstrated that democracy was not just a theory, but a lived reality. The women who gasped when American soldiers refused to punish them for their past allegiances were experiencing something more than surprise. They were experiencing the collapse of everything they had been taught about how the world worked, about the nature of power, about the relationship between the strong and the weak. They were experiencing, perhaps for the first time in 12 years, the presence of genuine freedom, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete reality embodied in the daily decisions of men who could have chosen cruelty but chose mercy instead. And in that experience, in that quiet, ordinary, revolutionary act of choosing mercy, lay the foundation upon which a new Germany and a new Europe would be built. The can sits in the museum still, a relic of that transformation, Empty now of everything but memory, but for those who know where to look, it remains full of meaning.